Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where followers of Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one thing that is happening in our American political world is the politicization of the border. If you are following the political news, you will find that more and more news stories and politicians are capitalizing on the issue of what is happening in immigration, especially at the border. It's happening now, and I predict it's going to intensify in the 2024 election season. And this is why I especially wanted to help our listeners to make sense of this issue correctly with as much biblical as well as factual information, because there's a tremendous amount of distortion that is happening on the issue of what is actually happening on the border. It's an issue that is really dear to my heart. I am an immigrant myself. I immigrated to this country when I was 3 years old, so I know how amazing it is to have an experience of being welcomed into this country, and how devastating it would be to be turned away and to sorry, let me take it up. This is an issue that's very dear to my heart. I am an immigrant myself. I immigrated to this country when I was 3 years old, so I know the great blessings of this country, and I know also how devastating it is to not experience welcome in this country. So it is important to me. I think it's important to Christians. If you are at all familiar with your Bible, the Old Testament is just filled constantly with this injunction to take care of the alien, the stranger, and the foreigner in your midst. In the biblical vision, we are told to understand that how we embody the welcoming presence of God to us is by extending that welcome to the alien, the fatherless, the foreigner, precisely who would be immigrants to us today in our present context, many of them who are coming in the border. So this is why I've taken 2 episodes, one episode last week and the episode this week, to help Christians make sense of what is happening at the border. So this is part 2, and my guest today is Mike Debruhl. All right. So one of the persons that I wanted to talk to was Michael Debruhl, because he has a very distinctive vantage point on what is happening at the border. Mike is the director of the Sacred Heart Shelter, which is in El Paso, Texas, which is really at ground zero of what is happening at the border. It is receiving the most number of, well, the city is receiving the most numbers of migrants, and the shelter is very much kind of a linchpin of the community in terms of how it is handling migrants. In addition, Mike arrived at that position from a very unique background. He is a retired Border Patrol executive who spent 26 years as a field agent in the Border Patrol unit, eventually rising to the role of assistant chief under the chief of Border Patrol. And so Mike has really seen what is happening at the border at multiple vantage points. So I was really interested to talk with Mike. And so, Mike, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you, Curtis. It's my pleasure to be here.
So, Mike, let's actually start with what's happening now, because you pretty much every day go to work just blocks away from the border. So tell us, what do you do? Like, what is your job? What does your day look like? And what are you seeing?
Well, thank you. I'm currently the director at Casa del Sagrado Corazón, which is also known as Sacred Heart Church Shelter. The shelter opened up in December of last year, due to an influx of migrants in the area. At that time, I think when I arrived on the scene, there were like 1,000 people surrounding the church and the shelter. So there was a significant influx at that time. So now, since then, there have been rises and falls in the amount of people coming across, but now we're operating in post Title 42 environment under the Biden administration's policies, current policies at the border. So you're
And so
seeing a
what
lot
does
of
that
people.
mean? What's changed in terms of what the Biden administration has done that's changed how the border is
Right. Well,
handling?
during
Yeah.
during Title 42, people that was affected during the last administration, and it was actually something that came out of a 1944 health policy that was affected in the United States. It was really never meant to be used on the border, but during that policy, people were there was during COVID. We can all remember that during that era. In March of 2020, it was affected on the border to keep people from spreading COVID who came into the United States. So in May, that program uh, was completed, and that is that it expired in mid-May of this year. So now we went back to what we had used on the border prior to that, which is the Immigration and Nationality Act, Title 8. Now, under that Title 8, the Biden administration affected certain policies, the usage of an online tool called CBP One, which is really an app that people use. It is now geofenced in Mexico, but people use the app. They apply for an appointment at the ports of entry, and they when they get that appointment, they show up at that appointment and are paroled into the United States for 2 years, and they are given also in short order permission to work in the United States.
Okay, so Mike, the news reports that we're getting is that the word crisis recurs over and over again, and so the image then is of a border being overrun, of just migrants swamping local municipalities like El Paso. Is that what's happening, or if not, I mean, because you are at ground zero, you're there every day welcoming migrants. Give us an accurate picture of what is happening.
Well, it's interesting, Curtis, because really, I retired in 2014, and um, in about 2016, 17, etc., what I was hearing coming out of the government and hearing in the news, I knew to be incorrect, and there were just some things that I couldn't abide by. So, just as a regular single person, a citizen, I volunteered at one of these shelters, handing out water, so helping serve meals, etc. And through that experience, I eventually came to be coordinating there, supervising there, etc. And then when this shelter opened up, the father there at Sacred Heart Church asked me to help him run the shelter. So that is why I started. It wasn't through any kind of a calling or etc. It was more that there were things that I knew not to be true, and that bothered me. And I thought, just the only thing I can do is just kind of volunteer and help at these shelters. And I hope that my role will actually provide some fidelity to the discussion, because there are a lot of misconceptions. I mean, what do we hear every day? That we're being invaded, as you mentioned, that we're being overrun, etc. But I think that when you look at migration across the southwest border, if you look at the CBP's website, you can find charts there. There's a good chart that shows migration from 1980 to 2022, and you have to really take a long look at the amount of people that have been coming across. Now, in 1986, there was almost 2 million entries. In 2000, which happened to be when I was in Washington D.C. working for the chief, we also almost had 2 million entries. So in 1986, almost 2 million, 2000, 2 million, and up to present day. So it's not the first time that this has happened. The only difference is now that I think there's a lot more press about it. In 2000, when I was in Washington, the general regular citizen knew nothing about that influx of migrants. The
So
only
hold
thing is
on,
today that
Mike,
it's publicized.
hold on for a second. You're telling me that the immigration levels in 1986 and 2000 and now in 2023 are roughly similar to one another?
Well, there was a significant influx of people coming across the border at that time. Yes, so this is not the first time that we've had large numbers of people coming across the border. And I think that when you listen to the news, you think, well, gosh, this is, got to be the first time this kind of thing has happened. But no, it's not. Except that, again, it's being publicized significantly. And so it's on all of our minds all the time. So when I look at those charts, I think, gosh, if we weren't all talking about this, or if it wasn't being publicized, would it be a big deal? And I'm not really sure that it would be on forefront in everybody's minds.
And from your perspective, why, if the numbers haven't really changed that much when you step back and look at the big historic trends, that there's always been this sort of surge, peaks and valleys, and we're in a peak, but not a peak that is historically outside of our experience. What's changed then? Why this different attention, this different focus that inflates these numbers. It doesn't inflate the numbers, but it makes those numbers seem like something that is extraordinary and unprecedented. What's going on?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, certainly it's partly political, but I think the difference today is that now we are seeing these people. I think in 1986 and 2000, all these encounters were people that did not have immigration papers. So I think that they kind of melded into society without you actually seeing them. Whereas today, 98, almost 100% of the migrants that we are seeing are here legally, so they're much more visible. So I think I think that's the big difference that I see. But again, it is obviously highly politicized, which it was not at that time.
Right. So so one difference is politicized. It's being used as a sort of a political weapon of some sort. So there's a lot more media attention to it. But you're also saying, in some ways, if I'm hearing you correctly, actually one reason why we're seeing more is because it's actually more orderly. Like, because in the past, people would just sort of meld in, and now they're actually going through the process, so they can actually be more. They're lining up in long lines. They're actually going through a process. Is that what you're describing?
Well, I was looking at the numbers in the shelter, and like I think 60% or 70% were CBP1 applicants. The rest have been processed and paroled by CBP into the United States. So all those people that we're seeing at the shelters, and that is just a microcosm of what you will see, along the
Okay.
border. That is almost absolutely 100% of all the people there are have been processed by CBP. 98%, and then a small percentage have applied for asylum on their own, asylum pro se. So yes, almost all these people that you see today um, in any given news report will be here legally.
So you've been through the border patrol through all these past years. Are you telling me that actually, in some ways, the border is actually more well regulated, such that people are actually coming in with the right proper paperwork than before? Like, is that is totally different than the narrative that is being perpetrated in the press? That in some ways things are collapsing at a historic rate.
Well, I think that the Biden administration, and let me say that neither the Biden administration nor the Trump administration or none of these administrations have done a great job at the border. I mean, I think that it's a big issue that a lot of administrations don't want to tangle with and don't know a lot about. So no one has a perfect record in that regard. But I think that the Biden administration, after a couple of years now, they've kind of gotten their feet under them. So they are trying to effect a more orderly process, and that is to allow more people to come in legally through the
Yeah.
CBP1 app than before. So yes, we're seeing their attempt is to have a much more orderly process as they come into the United States.
So, Mike, you talked about why you joined this shelter first as a volunteer, because you were saying that you felt like while you were working in the Border Patrol, there were misconceptions, mistruths being circulated, and you just felt like you had to do something about it. What were those misconceptions even back then? What were those misperceptions that you were like gnawing at you?
Well, this was after I retired. I
And
really
what
think
year
that
was that? Just to locate
like
that.
2014.
Okay. All
In
right.
2014. It's been almost 10 years now. So it was after I retired, like in 2016, 17, I started hearing a lot of things that I knew to be untrue. Again, things like, oh gosh, we're being invaded now. And then another thing is that, and you hear it quite often now, that we're being flooded by drugs that the migrants are bringing across. We've really got to seal up the border because they're killing our children, etc. And it's a very serious problem. But the truth is that more than 90% of the drugs all come in through the ports of entry. I mean, the cartel, they have unlimited funding. They buy thousands of semis and cars, and there are 390 ports of entry. And they run those ports of entry every day through this
So
methodology,
it's
and
not
that's
being
how the drugs get.
smuggled. It's not being smuggled over the fences, is what you're saying. It's going
No.
through the ports. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it would be very inefficient for them to put 100 pounds on my back and try to get me to run the gauntlet of infrastructure, manpower, and technology. And no,
Yeah,
they have there's almost 400 ports of entry. They have unlimited funding. They hit the ports of entry every day, and that's how all these drugs get into the country.
yeah. What else? What are other misconceptions that you felt like were being perpetrated while you were in the Border Patrol?
Well, again, it's after I got out, I started hearing things like, well, of course, they're all criminals, etc. There's a very interesting study, the Marshall Project. It was affected by four major universities, and in the study, they studied the correlation between uh, increase of migrant population in any given area and crime. In the United States, I believe this was from 1980 to 2016, our migrant population has increased by 118% during that time, that is. And crime actually went down by 36%. So what was neat about this study is that you can actually, there's a portal where you can put in different cities and see what that situation is, if there was any correlation there. As a matter of fact, I was looking at Atlanta, Georgia. They've almost had a 600% increase in their migrant populations from 1980 to 2016, and their violent crime decreased by 51%. And so, I mean, you can draw your own conclusion from that. But my life experience, if you will, was that generally speaking, and you've heard it all, that you've heard it for years, you always hear it, that people coming across the border are just trying to make a better lives for themselves. But that really is the truth to the great percentage of people. I mean, are there criminals coming across the border? Yes, you betcha they are. And I mean, CBP does a good job of tracking down those criminals, of discovering those criminals. But the greater, almost 100%, 99% of these people that come across are people just trying to seek a better life. So that is my life's truth, I think. And again, that is maybe what I can bring to this discussion. Is some fidelity to that, from what
Yeah,
we
well,
hear
go ahead.
to what's
Yeah,
actually happening.
we'll we'll keep doing that because you see these people every day at the shelter, and you saw them as a border patrol agent. Like, describe them for our listeners. What should they have? What are the different archetypes or pictures they should have in their mind when they think border immigrant? Like, who are these people? Humanize them for us.
Well, for example, in the shelter, I was looking at the numbers. So right now, we haven't across the people that are coming across the border, 70% or more are Venezuelans right now. So you look at the Venezuelan economy. What happened was that now it's interesting because Venezuela has like 19.5% of all the oil reserves in the world are under the ground in Venezuela. So you would think that that would be a country that was doing very well, but actually in 2014 the bottom fell out of oil prices. The price of a barrel of oil went from $100 to $30, and the government was so dependent on oil that it created significant havoc in the economy there, which created a lot of unrest. The president there is somewhat of a despot. Those are his tendencies, and so he really cracked down on the bad press, killed a bunch of people, and just did a lot of bad things. And so from that, the citizenry was cut off from the general currencies that are generally available, loans, etc. As a matter of fact, in 2022, we complain here about inflation, but in 2022, their inflation rate hit 2,000%. If you talk to Venezuelans that have come across, what they say is, uh, I've heard that you just cannot work enough or have enough jobs to support your family. Every day, they lose about 5,000 people from their country. There have been more than 7 million people have left Venezuela. That's over a quarter of the population, and they're not just coming here. There was 500,000 in Spain last year, and other areas so they're fleeing. They're just fleeing the country all over the world. But that's basically what you see is people just trying to survive, and that's a general picture that you see most of the time.
So, if I'm an average American, I think what you're telling me is, look, don't think of these migrants as, the classic criminal, rapist, drug trafficker, and so forth. These are people trying to make a living, trying to survive, being forced out of their home by very difficult circumstances. So, okay, I can maybe get my head around that, but as I'm putting myself in the shoes of a typical American, I could say, but don't bring all these people to have such that we have to care for them. They're going to be a
Right.
burden on our society. How would you speak to that person who has that fear of, okay, maybe these people aren't threats, but they're going to be a burden to our society?
Well, I think that you find that most of these people, they want to work, they want to be productive citizens, and so I think that the USCIS now through the Trump administration is going to try to get them work permits at a faster fashion. There's quite a backlog on that, but I think that that's what you find. They want to be productive citizens. They want to work. So that is generally what you see. And I think that there are 8 million jobs here in the United States, Curtis, that we cannot fill. So
Yep.
we need to look at at how uh, at migration and how that can be a positive thing. And I think if everybody kind of know would if everybody knew the story of migrants in the United States, I mean, you would see that that is basically a good historical picture. And so, rather than demonize migrants, I think that we need to figure out if there are people coming in, what is the correct path for them to come in? What can we do to make that a positive thing for the United States? How can that be fixed? How can that system be fixed, etc.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with the truth. I mean, that's really kind of what pushed me into like volunteering at that shelter was that I was hearing a lot of things that were not true, and it affects next pretty soon we're going to have the holidays where the holidays are upon us, and I think that we need to start with what is actually happening, who is coming across the border, and we used to have these discussions in the United States, where it's okay if you disagree, and that's fine, and that
Yeah.
we need to disagree. It's healthy to have these discussions, but I think that we need to start with the truth, and uh, that's really what we're lacking right now in this society.
Yeah. Okay, so let me just summarize some things that you're telling us is actually true based on your both on data and your real life experiences. You've been telling us, look, actually, the levels of immigration that we're seeing currently shouldn't really be called an unprecedented crisis. It falls within the peaks and valleys historically that go back as far as 1986, 2000, and 2023. You're telling us that actually the people coming in are coming in not as criminals, not as drug traffickers. Most of the drug trafficking is run through the ports of entry, not because through individual migrants. They're going through shipping containers and so forth. So you can't connect sort of the refugee crisis with drug trafficking, really. You're also telling us that the crime rates haven't been shown to actually be correlated to migrant levels. Okay, those are all very different sort of pictures. Then you're also telling us that actually they're coming in usually wanting to work, coming from a country a place in which they weren't able to work, so they're very hungry to work, and wanting to take some of these 8 million jobs that aren't being currently filled. Those all seem those I buy that, and those all seem like very helpful truths. They all seem to be truths though that point towards a pro-immigration kind of perspective. Is there any truths that you would say, you know what, you really need to wrestle with this if as this is a downside I'm seeing, or this is something that you would be a case to be made for people who want to limit immigration? Is there anything that you're seeing that falls into that bucket of truth you want to share?
Well, I mean, there is a problem in that we don't have the systems in place for this influx of people that are coming to the United States. I mean, Chicago is concerned about all the migrants there, New York, etc. We don't have the pathways, we don't have the systems in place to handle all these people who are coming in and to have them get work permits for them to work, places for them to work, communities where they're needed, etc. So that's what we have to wrestle with right now. How do we, for example, I've had meetings with the people from Chicago and other cities, New York, and they have mentioned that other cities have come to them and said, "How do we bring migrants to our community? We would welcome migrants, but we just don't know how to do it." So I think it's when I think about it, I think of it like a system of highways that just has not been developed yet.
Mm.
This can be a positive influx, a positive thing for the country. There are many places that would welcome migrants into the community, but those pathways are just
Yeah,
not set up yet.
there's numerous communities in the Midwest that are dying, that their populations are
Yes.
declining, and they need influx of people who are wanting to come and live and work there. So it sounds like you're saying when you think about the border crisis, you can't think of just what is happening at the border. You have to think of what's happening at the rest of the country as kind of the pipeline behind the border, such that it can actually, because if you don't have the pipeline to actually integrate people in the society, of course things are going to back up at the intake point at the border. Is that a kind of a helpful way to think about it?
Yes, and listen, Curtis, that immigration is it's a very difficult and complicated thing. So these are the things that we're wrestling with, and I mean, the United States, I believe, just like any developed country, has the right to affect immigration laws on the border. But just as long as everybody is treated with respect, everybody is um, that migrants aren't demonized, etc. I think that the sign of a strong country is not the demonization of migrants, but rather that you treat everyone well and with respect and with dignity, etc. That you effectuate those
Yeah.
laws in a dignified manner.
And it seems like one of the laws you're talking about is just, can we get an actual established pathway for people to become legal immigrants in a way that is effective, efficient, rational in a way? To explain to people what's missing. Why don't we have this sort of clear, efficient, legal, rational way for migrants, a pathway for them to follow?
Well, I mean, there hasn't been any significant immigration reform since 1996 and 1986 before that, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which was during Ronald Reagan's administration. That's
Yeah.
37 years ago. Uh,
Right. So we've been stuck kind of in the old in a different era almost.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as a matter of fact, it's interesting because the Immigration Reform and Control Act, Ronald Reagan, one of the most conservative presidents in the history of the United States, actually created a pathway for almost 3 million migrants that were in the country already. So there are a multitude of things that you can do to alleviate the pressure in this system, but as far as immigration reform, holistically, because we are so separated, if you will, at this time in history, I mean, it's almost impossible to get anything done. So I think that we
Yeah.
have to figure out what is our role in this great migration, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah. And you're talking about the political gridlock in
That's
Congress, for
correct.
instance,
Yeah, that's correct.
that can't pass
Sure.
any legislation, right? That such that again we're stuck with sort of outdated legislation. Give us an example of how it's outdated. Like, what is a law? Why is the current legal structure for immigration unable to handle the current realities? Can you illustrate where this is breaking down?
Well, a lot of people point out that if you come through the legal path or the historical legal pathways that are already set up, it takes 10 to 20 years to get uh,
Hmm.
to come into the country legally, to become a citizen, etc. I mean, you take the dreamers. They've been here for years, not knowing from day to day kind of what's going to happen. It's got to be a terrible way to live.
Yeah.
And again, we don't have systems set up that are logical, as you mentioned, that are logical, that make sense, that help the country, that help the
Yeah.
economy. I mean, we're really kind of stuck in gridlock, as you mentioned. I think that's a good word. A good word. We're really kind of
Yeah.
stuck, not being able to go forward, and not being able to go any other way either. It just doesn't make any
Mike,
sense.
explain for our listeners the situation of the dreamers. I think some people may know that, but I don't think everybody knows kind of just the legal sort of nightmare that dreamers are stuck in. Who are the dreamers and why are they stuck? Explain that
So
for
these
us.
are people who were brought in by their parents and who were actually born in another country, and for many of them had no idea that they were not United States citizens for a great time. So they have wrestled. There have been different laws trying to make them legal or trying to give them pathways to become legal for quite a few years now. And you have to apply to the program. You have to reapply. You have to ensure that you're following all the rules, and they change from time to time. And so with different administrations, Okay, where there have been several times when they're right on the cusp of creating a pathway for these dreamers, and then only that to be postponed or struck down, and then the next administration comes around, and so they never know from day to day, month to month, whether they'll be kicked out of the program if they don't reapply in time. Something might happen, and so it's just been a ball that has been bounced from administration to administration, and these people's lives, they can't really go forward with any stability. They're stuck in that
Yeah.
program.
Mike, it seems like given that the government through, and especially through Congress, has been so gridlocked to actually promote any systematic reform, it has fallen on uh, nonprofits, civic associations, and especially churches to step in the gap. And Sacred Heart Shelter is an example of that. Give explain more how what churches are doing, why they're so crucial to this, sort of system of response that's trying to make up for the lack of a rational government policy.
Well, I think that the church as a whole provides refuge all over the world for people who need that refuge and respite, who are fleeing, refugees from wars and governments that are persecuting them, etc. So what I found was that, like in December of last year, was that people feel safe. They feel safe around churches, and they know that the churches will help them to the fullest degree that they can. It was amazing to me, right before Title 42 expired. Every day I would do a count outside the church and the shelter, and at one time there were 1,300 people camping outside the shelter and the church. And it's because they feel safe there. And for centuries, the church has provided refuge for people that are fleeing, that are migrating across continents, etc. So when all else is lacking, when there are other systems that are not available to people who are seeking refuge, the church has always been there. And I
Yeah.
think will always be there. They play such a big role in migration across the globe.
Mike, what would you like to see happen in the next year? Because
Gosh.
we're heading into an election season. Immigration is going to be, I think, used as a political weapon. What, like, if you could wave a magic wand, you know, what would you like to see happen in our country when it comes to immigration?
Well, again, I just think that we need to talk. We need to talk. We're not talking about migration, and when we do, there are so many mistruths. There's disinformation, there's misinformation, etc. And I think that that's where we really need to start. Is we need to talk about this in an honest, forthright manner, and and thinking about finding a path forward. And listen, you can agree, you can be for migration or against migration, but I think you need to sit down and talk about it and figure out what is the best thing for the United States. I mean, most of us are patriotic. What is the best thing? What is the best path? This is happening. People flee, and I think it's not only here in the United States. The people seeking refuge is at an all-time high all around the world. But for the United States, between myself and my brother-in-law or people who disagree, I think we just need to figure out what the truth is and what the actual logical path forward is that will help everyone involved. That's what I would like to see. I'd love to see that. And I think that I speak a lot to groups that come across along the border, come to the border for immersion tours, and I think that's what's interesting is that many people who are not from the border don't know anything about the border, what is really happening here. So I think that's where it needs to begin. Is with the truth. What is the truth? What is really happening, and how do we move forward from here? That if I could wave a magic wand and I could get uh, this bifurcated Congress, the Senate talking, that's where we need to start.
when and you're touching on a very contested problem
Sure.
in our American society and politics, which is, well, how do you know what's true? Which is probably actually really helpful to have somebody who is like you on the ground, who has seen it from both sides or all sides, from the border patrol as well as from the shelter perspective. This is why I so much wanted to share your voice with our listeners. How else can people understand and discover the true story of what's happening? What would you recommend they look at? Are there websites, news sources that you particularly feel like are doing a good job at covering the truth of what's happening here?
Well, I would say the first thing is probably volunteer someplace where you would have actual contact with migrants or people seeking refuge. I think that is the best way to kind of put a face
Yeah.
to the refugee influx in the United States. That would be the first thing that I would really recommend. It's very difficult,
Hmm.
as you mentioned, like with any subject. What is the truth? With the internet,
Yeah.
and it's hard to know what is the truth on any given subject that's important to you. But I
Yeah.
think that's where it needs to begin. Volunteer, talk. If you want to know the truth, talk to people who are dealing with people who are working with people that are migrating, people who seek refuge, religious organizations, and other organizations that don't specifically have an agenda um,
Yeah.
in this on this subject.
Mike, I want to just on the issue of truth. Um, I remember when I heard one of your presentations, you did a really, for me, an eye-opening presentation on the wall,
Yeah.
right? Because this the whole political mythology about we need to build this wall, and
Yeah.
that was advanced by the Trump administration, and then even my some of my friends who are like thoughtful, intelligent people, are like, yeah, we need to build more wall. Talk to people about the wall and what is the realities of the wall on the border.
Well, it's interesting because the wall, actually, there was a study on infrastructure on the border in 2000, and along with the Army, the Border Patrol did a study. They went to the 9 Southwest border chiefs and asked them if you could have any kind of infrastructure you wanted to help you with your job. And mind you, there were very few Border Patrol agents at that time. I think there were maybe 5,000. Now there are, I think their cap is 21,000. There's probably about 19,000 agents out there now. All of them asked for roads. Some of them asked for drainage projects, levees, and a few of them asked for fences. And the fences were purely um, for to drive like people away from dangerous areas, to drive people towards where their agents could encounter these folks, etc. But there was never any discussion about fencing the southwest border. As a matter of fact, the verbiage that was used at that time in all those documents was fences where fence makes sense. So again, it was purely for purposes of effectuating uh, better control in certain areas or driving people away from danger. There were certain areas where if you come across the border, it's easy to get across, but you have to walk for 2 weeks or something to get anywhere. And if it's hot, a lot of people die. So I think that was a big concern. But again, now this was in 2000, and actually, most of the fence was built out of the Secure Fence Act, which was passed in 2006 in the George Bush administration. They actually built most of the fencing. The last administration actually only built 52 miles of fence, which was, I think,
Wait, stop for a second. The Trump administration only built 52 miles of fence
of primary fencing. Yes, they mostly
of primary
they
fencing.
mostly replaced old fence and did some secondary fencing, but of new fence they only built 52 miles. Most was built
Okay.
during the George Bush administration, and then Obama they built I think 181 miles of fencing, but during the last administration only
Wait,
52
so
miles.
Obama built more of the wall than Trump did?
Yes, yes, sure did. Yeah.
Okay. This is another example of how people simply, have been told a different story about what is happening on the border. And so it sounds like you're saying is like actually the border patrol people, the people who are actually tasked with guarding the border, don't want that's not top on their list is more of a wall, more fencing. That's just not how you actually secure the borders.
Well, not having been for there for 10 years. I'm not sure, what the discussion is within the Border Patrol, the higher ranks at this juncture, but when I know that when this study was initially done, that uh, that was not the number one thing. The number one thing was getting to the border. I think in many places it was very hard to get to the border. That was the number one thing that they asked for were roads to get to the border. But no, fencing was
Yeah.
not the number one thing, and it hasn't been until the last 10 years or so that this has really been blown up. So um, I think that fences can help in some areas, but another thing is that you're never going to stop migration with a fence. I mean, really, it's that's why that bothers me a bit, because building fences is extremely expensive. It's over $1 million a mile, certainly. I think we spent 2.3 billion in the first 2006 Secure Fence Act building the first stretch of fencing. So it's very expensive. It really doesn't stop. I mean, you cannot fence the whole southwest border. As a matter of fact, there are many places where the fence ends. It just ends because it's not needed. There are mountains there, or the river is large in that area, etc. So there are many places where the fence just ends. So we're not
Yeah.
really fencing, and
Yeah.
there was never an intent to fence the southwest border.
Mike, you've been just great in terms of correcting some misconceptions. I really love your suggestion that you said earlier to people to like try to, even if you're not living close to the border, there's a good chance that somewhere in your community is a church, is a nonprofit, some sort of agency that is working with migrants. And if you can volunteer with them, that's a way to touch this problem at the human level and to actually hear from people what is the migrant experience really like. What else can people do? Let's say people can't do that; they don't have time, or for whatever reason, that's just not feasible. What else can they do to either learn or contribute to responding helpfully to the issue of immigration?
Well, gosh, there are multiple websites out there that you can go to, and I would suggest that you go to the CBP websites. It's very informative. You can kind of
Okay.
see, and a lot of the information that I talk to people about is information that comes directly from the government. For example, another misconception is that all the migrants are smuggling drugs and humans across. But when I looked up all the charts and the information on that, uh, about 80% are U.S. citizens that are caught smuggling. They're not they're
Mm,
not migrants, etc. So you just really have to study with an eye towards trying to find the truth. So, and I steer away from any information, any websites that are either very far to the right or very far to the left. I absolutely steer away from those. I try to find information that comes from studies that don't have a specific agenda, and
mhm.
that's where you can really find the truth. Is just go out there, try to find information, but
Well,
if you're
we'll get
interested,
some of these. Yeah, we'll get some of these links from you, and we'll put
yeah,
them in the show notes for
sure.
our listeners. But what about for folks who want to help, who realize that these are human beings that should be treated with respect, dignity, as well as just compassion and care, and some of them are coming in very desperate situations. How can people help if they don't want to get politicized, if they don't want to debate the issue, they just want to help? How do you help other than volunteering? Where can they what are some places they can give money, for instance, that you would recommend?
Well, it's funny because I receive phone calls, I get emails from all over the country, of people that are wanting to help, and you can just donate to any organization that is helping migrants. I get donations of clothes. We have an Amazon wish list up on the up
All
on
right.
our
Well, Mike,
social
you supply
media
that all
sites.
to supply
Sure.
that all to me, and we'll get that in the show notes, and we'll get our listeners, especially in this Thanksgiving season. It would be a great way for us to share all of our blessings with the migrant, the homeless, the stranger in our midst,
Yes,
as the Bible
absolutely.
talks about these people. All right,
Um,
Mike, thanks so much for coming on
sure.
and sharing and correcting so much misconception about what is happening at the border, and also especially what needs to happen beyond the border as a society to welcome in the migrants. Mike, thanks so much for joining us
Well, and
here.
thank
Good for
you.
you.
Always a pleasure, Curtis.
All right. And listeners, next week, once again, we will gather around the campfire.